And we're live.
We are live. All right. Thank you, Frank. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for bearing with us.
Yeah, me too.
Hi everyone. Sorry I'm late.
Hey, Kurt.
Sorry. I'm back-to-backs today.
That's okay.
Hi Felicia, Allison, Mike, Sam, Captain Real. I think
Kurt,
I covered everyone. I don't see Christy on here. Happy Wednesday.
Kurt, I think you're on.
Happy Wednesday.
Kurt,
this is
I think
our
you're
first,
on a different
You're lying, Kurt. We can hear you.
Kurt, you're on a different line. There we go. All right.
All right. Welcome everyone.
Take two.
This is Todd Nettesheim. I'm with the EPA Great Lakes National Program Office, and I'm the acting DFO for the Great Lakes Advisory Board. And I'm opening the meeting today of the Great Lakes Advisory Board. Thank you for bearing with us at the outset as we were dealing with some logistical issues and some technical challenges there. I would like to welcome all the members of the Great Lakes Advisory Board that are here with us today, and all of the members of the public and other stakeholders and interested parties that are participating via the live stream. At this time, I would like each board member to turn on their camera and introduce themselves. I am going to go to a gallery view, and I'm just going to go down my list to point people out so people aren't talking over each other. So I'm going to start with Scudder.
Yes. My name is Scudder Mackey. I'm with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, and I am the GLAB chair.
Thank you, Scudder. Lisa?
Hi, I'm Lisa Freedy. I am the Director of Regulatory Affairs for the Chemical Industry Council of Illinois.
Thank you, Lisa. Larry?
Yes, good afternoon. Larry Antosh with the Ohio Farm Bureau. I'm Senior Director of Policy Development and Environmental Policy, representing the agricultural interests.
Thank you, Larry. Sylvia?
Good afternoon. I am Sylvia Orduno. I'm a longtime community organizer with Michigan Welfare Rights Organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Alan?
Thanks, Todd. Al Steinman, the Alan and Helen Hunting Research Professor at Annis Water Resources Institute of Grand Valley State University.
Thanks, Al. Kyle?
Hi, everybody. Kyle Dreyfus-Wells, Chief Executive Officer of the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District.
Thank you, Kyle. Laura?
Good afternoon. I'm Laura Rubin. I'm the Director of the Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition.
Thank you, Laura. John?
Hi, John Hull. I'm a senior consultant with Verdantis, representing consulting engineers in the environmental sector.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
And Frank?
Yes, Frank Etowah-Geshik. I'm the Executive Director of the United Tribes of Michigan, live up in Northern Michigan. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. And Scudder, let me ask you, am I missing anyone? You're on mute, Scudder.
I don't believe so. I'm not sure that Chairman Williams was able to make it today.
Okay, thank you. All right, so briefly, I just want to provide a welcome from EPA. I am here on behalf of the Glenpo Director, Chris Korleski, who sends his regrets. He would like to be here today, but he is participating in an interview panel for some manager position within our office. So collectively, we again just want to thank the board for all of your work over the last 4 or 5 months addressing these charge questions that are in front of you. The work of the board is just so critical to EPA and the rest of the federal agencies on the implementation of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And it's even more so now as we are developing the next action plan, Action Plan 4 for the GLRI. This action plan will guide our activities over a 5-year period, and the charge questions that the board is deliberating on are really going to help us develop an action plan, not only in content, but our engagement with the public and communities on the development of the plan. So we're really looking forward to hearing your conversations today, and then ultimately at some point seeing draft recommendations and final recommendations. So again, thank you for your service to this board. It's so incredibly valuable and critical to the implementation of the GLRI. And with that, Scudder, I'm going to turn it over to you as the chair of the advisory board.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Todd. I just saw a note that I believe Kay Nelson also is a member of the board, is not here yet. So I believe we were down 2 board members, but that's fine. Again, I would like to welcome everyone to this public meeting of the Great Lakes Advisory Board. This is a very interesting time for us. We're developing Action Plan 4. US EPA is developing Action Plan 4. And we have a very diverse group of people on the board from all walks of life in different levels of expertise and interest. And so far, it's been a very interesting process that we are going through to develop a set of recommendations so that we can improve Action Plan 4 and specifically address the 3 charge questions that have been provided to us to assist US EPA. I would like to first, let's walk through the agenda, the draft agenda that we have. First of all, what we'd like to do is have Todd review the charge questions that we have for the Great Lakes Advisory Board, specifically what EPA is looking for in terms of some of our advice and recommendations. We did do this in December at our last public meeting. This is the second public meeting. And I think for the public, it would be good to have a refresher on those charge questions. Then I will take a few minutes to review the process that the GLAB has gone through in terms of forming work groups to adjust the charge questions, and to also describe the process and some of the steps that we are taking to seek information related to addressing these questions, and how we are engaging with people across the basin, with agencies and NGOs and communities and other folks to get the most information possible and to learn from others in terms of how we can actually implement Action Plan 4 more effectively. Also, there will be a period of time, about 45 minutes, when our 2 work group leads, Kyle Dreyfus-Wells and Dr. Ellen Steinman, will lead a GLAB discussion focused on each of the 3 charge questions that Todd will describe in more detail in a moment. We will then have a brief discussion on synergies. And what we mean by that is that there may be opportunities for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative to invest in projects or initiatives that address all of the charge questions simultaneously. And so we are looking for ways that we can be more efficient and that GLRI can be more efficient in meeting these charge questions. And then finally, there will be a period for public comment. Right now, I will say that we did receive 2 requests for public comment. One is in written form, so will not be present at the meeting. And the second request for public comment has been withdrawn, and that was oral. So what we would like to do is perhaps make the public comment period available for those who are participating and specifically who are registered for the Zoom meeting to provide any or ask any questions during the public comment period. And in order to do that, you will have to send an email by 3 o'clock this afternoon to Frank Bajowski at capconcorp.com. I believe the email address is in the chat. I will just verbally say the email address. It's FBAJOWSKI at capconcorp.com. If you send an email address to Frank, we will have a list of folks. We will call on those folks, and they can ask their questions, and the board members can respond to the questions. So we want to maximize public input if at all possible. The last thing I would say is that where we are in our process, we have had multiple meetings. We have been meeting virtually on a monthly basis, each of the individual work groups. And we are at a point where we've had robust discussions and are in the process of developing our initial draft recommendations. So we will have an active discussion, GLAB discussion, for about 45 minutes. And we would certainly be interested in public input and comment on what we discuss. And we are certainly looking for additional information and guidance as well. So what I'd like to do is, if we could bring up the first set of slides, please.
Yeah, Scudder, sorry, could you repeat the email address, please?
Okay. FB is in Bravo, AJOWSKI ampersand or at CAPCONCORP.com, COM. Maybe we could have picked a somewhat simpler email address, but this sort of happened at the last minute. So, okay, Todd, if you want to go ahead and discuss the charge questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Scudder, and I appreciate the board's interest and efforts to try and accommodate anyone that's listening to the live stream to get off the live stream and join the Zoom meeting at the appropriate time to provide a public comment. If for whatever reason there is an issue with that email address, my name right there, if you Google my name plus EPA, I'm assuming you'll find my EPA address. I have my email up on this screen, so you can also reach out to me and I'd be able to pass along that request to Frank Bajowski as well. Scudder asked me to give a quick overview of the 3 charge questions that EPA charged the Great Lakes Advisory Board with in December of last year. So John, if you move to the next slide, I am just going to very briefly discuss each of these questions. The board members are intimately aware and know these backwards and forwards. This is really for those participating via live stream. So the first question was how to ensure effective and representative public input into the development of the GLRI Action Plan 4. And here is where, we ask sub-questions about should EPA and our federal partners of the regional working group use a similar format of engagement as what we did 5 years ago in the development of Action Plan 3. We were looking for any recommendations on specific steps that could be taken to ensure that we are providing opportunities for meaningful engagement with underserved communities. We were also looking for recommendations about, are there other groups or organizations that we should be reaching out to have meaningful engagement with that maybe we historically under GLRI have not involved. And then we're looking for how do we sort of balance some of the input that is that we may receive from underserved communities where their top priorities may not necessarily be related to the activities of the GLRI, or at least immediately related to the activities of the GLRI. How could we ensure that we are not only listening effectively, but being able to also get some input related to GLRI? So question number 2, John. This is related to incorporating diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in the next GLRI action plan. So I do want to state that we received some really helpful and useful recommendations from the advisory board on a previous set of charge questions where a final report was delivered to EPA in April of 2022. So here it's sort of building off some of those initial recommendations and looking for specific examples of how environmental justice and DEIJ could best be incorporated into Action Plan 4 with an ask to the board of using the Action Plan 3 as a template for providing those recommendations. And question number 3, John. Again, we received some really useful input and recommendations from the advisory board in that previous set. So much like the previous charge question, trying to build upon those and looking for specific examples of how climate resilience and climate change could best be incorporated into the action plan, using Action Plan 3 as a template. And we also asked the question about, in the GLRI working definition of resilience, do we, or how should we, better incorporate climate adaptation into that working definition? So those are the 3 charge questions in a nutshell. Those are posted on glri.us on the Great Lakes Advisory Board page. So with that, I will turn it back to the GLAB chair to proceed with the next agenda topic.
Thank you, Todd. What I will try to do now is give you an introduction to the GLAB work group process, how we've structured ourselves, and basically the steps that we're taking to receive and collect information from various places across the basin in order to inform ourselves and develop a set of recommendations that will assist US EPA in addressing these charge questions and actually implementing these charges. I need to have the next set of slides, please, John. Thank you. As we just discussed, the Great Lakes Advisory Board has been tasked to address 3 charge questions, which Todd has gone through, related to the development and implementation of Action Plan 4 to guide investments made by the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. The first 2 charge questions are related to stakeholder engagement and development of Action Plan 4 and how GLRI can more effectively engage with and provide resources to underserved and environmental justice communities in the Great Lakes region. The third charge question, as Todd mentioned, is focused on ways to incorporate and enhance climate resiliency and adaptive management principles into the GLRI investments that are made in Great Lakes communities and in Great Lakes ecosystems. So to address these charges, we divided the GLAB, the Great Lakes Advisory Board, into 2 separate work groups. The first work group is what we call the Stakeholder and Environmental Justice Work Group. They are basically working with charge question 1 on stakeholder engagement and charge question 2, which is focused on environmental justice and underserved communities. And the members of the GLAB are listed on the left side of the slide. Kyle Dreyfus-Wells has agreed to be the work group chair for the Stakeholder and Environmental Justice Work Group. Lisa Freedy, Kay Nelson, Sylvia Arduino, Laura Rubin and Chairman James Williams are members of that work group. I believe that Kay and Chairman Williams are unable to attend the meeting today. So I believe we have 4 representatives from that work group with us today. The climate resiliency work group is focused on charge question 3, which is on focused on climate resiliency and adaptive management, and how we can incorporate climate resiliency not only into Action Plan 4, but also into the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative investments and projects that are made in the basin in the future. Al Steinman is agreed to be the work group chair. Larry Antosh, Frank Edwashik, John Hull, and myself are members of the climate resiliency work group. As I mentioned earlier, these work groups have been meeting on a regular basis, generally monthly, on occasion bi-monthly basis. We usually hold virtual meetings. However, a number of weeks ago, we actually met in person in Chicago at US EPA headquarters to have separate in-person work group meetings, and also actually listen to a joint presentation on environmental justice and other work by US EPA to focus on how they are addressing underserved communities at a national level. And also we learned about the major priorities of US EPA in terms of their goals and objectives in achieving environmental justice and meeting underserved community needs. This was very helpful to us because it helped provide a framework in terms of how we may move forward in terms of addressing or creating the recommendations for those 2 charge questions. Next slide, please. We also are using a sort of a phased approach to approach the charge questions. Phase 1, which is basically what we're in the process of completing now, has started in January and should be done by late June, early July, where we hope to have a set of draft recommendations in hand. And primarily, we are addressing the what question. What specifically could be done or should be done by US EPA and the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, and also the regional work group partners to improve public and underserved community understanding and engagement in terms of the implementation of Action Plan 4. We also want to incorporate climate resiliency and adaptation into Action Plan 4. And so these are the what questions in terms of the specific things that need to be done. Phase 2, which would start in July, will be focused on identifying potential implementation strategies. So the difference is that the what questions are, what do we do and where do we do it? And then the phase 2 would be, how would this best be implemented by US EPA or their federal partners when actually implementing Action Plan 4. With respect to timeframes, in the last GLAB cycle, we were able to identify timeframes over which specific recommendations could be implemented. You could have a short time frame, an intermediate time frame, or a long-term time frame. And for these charge questions, it's very similar. So I suspect that as we make our recommendations, we will also be sorting them in terms of the timeframes in which they can be implemented. For example, for certain specific types of recommendations that are directly directed toward the actually development of Action Plan 4, those recommendations will have to be implemented over a very short time frame. But there may be other recommendations related to underserved communities or environmental justice communities or climate resiliency that will actually have to take place later on as we develop capacity in those communities to actually address these either climate related or other environmental issues. And that would be done through a series of investments made by the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative over the next 3 to 5 years through the life of Action Plan 4. So next slide, please. Okay. Also, in terms of our strategic approach, this is sort of a description of the types of actions and the work that we've been doing for the last 4 to 5 months. First and foremost, you may recall that the one of the charge questions is focused on or ask us to evaluate, is Action Plan 3 appropriate? What do we need to change in Action Plan 3? And specifically, when we look at the 3 questions, the 3 charge questions, stakeholder engagement, environmental justice, underserved communities, and climate resiliency, what we have done is we have met with the individual focus area leads and have had external discussions with various entities about the progress that's been made on Action Plan 3, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and what can we do better. One point I would make with respect to climate, I believe the word climate was mentioned once in Action Plan 3, and that's actually in a paragraph, an introductory paragraph at the beginning of Action Plan 3. I will say to Focus Area 4's credit, a number of about 3 years ago, 2 years ago, actually, about 2.5 years ago, they invested funds in a framework for resilient investments. It's basically an evaluation that's being done by a number of federal agencies, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, USGS, and NOAA, to actually evaluate potential future climate change scenarios in order to incorporate that information into the design of new Great Lakes Restoration Initiative projects. This is not something that was necessarily part of Action Plan 3, but this is an example of the need, the significant need to incorporate climate into these investments to make sure that they are viable and continue to function well into the future as we see changes in weather and in Great Lakes water levels. The second component that we are doing is certainly we are engaging with numerous agencies, including US EPA, of course, but other federal and state agencies. We are talking with individual communities. We have tribal representation, talking with the tribes and the indigenous peoples, non-governmental organizations, again, focused on these 3 specific charge questions. And we are basically trying to learn about what some of these other entities are doing with respect to stakeholder engagement and what their thoughts are in terms of improving Action Plan 3. Also, we are looking at ways that some of these entities are starting to engage with underserved communities and environmental justice communities. Are there specific steps that they are taking or programs that they are initiating that could also be incorporated into some of the recommendations that we may make with respect to information we provide to US EPA for Action Plan 4. And then the other thing that we're doing is engaging with many of the, in addition to the focus area leads, with US EPA staff and the senior leadership, again, the tribes and communities, and not just with respect to these questions, but also in terms of how can we more efficiently implement these recommendations into US EPA in terms, can we improve the process, okay? And this, in terms of, let's say, community engagement, an example would be that in Action Plan 3, there were numerous public meetings that were held, and I believe that very soon a series of public meetings will be held for Action Plan 4. The point being is that I think that the federal agencies have been very good at receiving information from the communities, but they're not all that good in terms of responding back to those communities. And I think that that's something that we may be able to look at, and it's something that we're starting to understand better from these discussions that we're having with these local communities and some of the other entities that are working or receiving GLRI funding. So finally, we are seeking case studies to highlight the work that's done, and particularly case studies that are related to underserved communities or environmental justice and or climate resiliency. Case studies are very helpful because they provide templates and or they can provide real world guidance in terms of how do you implement or what can you do to implement these types of projects or these types of investments, and will that help us be more successful in terms of meeting the action plan for goals and objectives. And then finally, one of the things that we want to explore are synergies. And by synergies, what we're talking about is our investments, that a single investment, a project investment or an investment in a community could actually address all three charge questions. They could address stakeholder engagement, they could address the underserved communities and the environmental justice issues, and they could also incorporate and address climate resiliency and incorporate adaptive management. So those types of integrated projects that address this broad range of requirements as is represented by these charge questions, I think is something that we would certainly encourage GLRI and US EPA to think about. So I believe that is the last slide for my presentation. If we slide to the next, if we go to the next slide, I believe we can, I'll invite Kyle Dreyfus, sorry. Invite Kyle Dreyfus Wells and Ellen Steinman to lead a facilitated discussion of the GLAB board, please.
Great. Thank you, Scudder. Al, do you want me to start off?
Yes, please go ahead, Kyle.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Kyle Dreyfus Wells. As I said, I'm with the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District in Cleveland, Ohio. And I have the great pleasure of working with the members of the work group that are looking at charge questions 1 and 2. So our work group has 2 goals, obviously, and they align with our charge questions, which is to provide suggestions to improve the public engagement and the public input in the development of Action Plan 4, and then also to provide real tangible examples. Scudder talked about case studies, and if anyone is listening on the live stream, participating in this meeting, if you have an example of where there's been great, authentic, I hate the word authentic, but it really applies in this situation, authentic engagement where folks are in the process, feel heard in the process, please bring that to our attention in any way, shape, or form. So that's our first, those are our goals. And regarding goal 1, in terms of public engagement and public input into the development of Action Plan 4, as Scudder mentioned, we have these upcoming public engagement sessions. They're the first 2, I think, Todd, are noted on EPA's, the first 4 are noted on EPA's website. And of course, you know, the first one is in Cleveland. I mean, for sure, that's the way that that would happen. The first one is in Cleveland next week. And so please, you know, if you can attend in your city, that would be great. And there's also virtual option. So as Scudder mentioned, we continue to have conversations with the agency as they look for public engagement, public input in the development of Action Plan 4, in terms of not only capturing that input, but responding to it in a way that folks actually feel heard. So that's been a big topic of conversation for the work group when we've been talking with each other and when we've been talking with the agency. But what I really want to turn your attention to is the work that the conversations that the work group has been having around charge question 2, which is focusing on, again, examples of successful incorporation of diversity, equity, and inclusion into the specific focus areas of Action Plan 4. And with that, I want to highlight the work that's already been done by Healing Our Waters and turn it over to Laura Rubin, the director of Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition, to walk us through what Healing Our Waters has done in terms of aligning suggestions for better engagement and better responsiveness to diversity, equity, and inclusion and environmental justice with the specific focus areas. So Laura, I'll turn it over to you. And as you transition and bring up your slides, I'm going to keep talking. This is going to be a long handoff. So as Laura brings up her slides, we're really looking for any reactions that folks have to what Laura's going to run through. And we look forward to the discussion. Al, do you want to say anything before Laura starts?
No, why don't you finish off your 2 questions and then we'll transform over to me.
Okay.
Take your time, Laura. Go through it. It's comprehensive and it's interesting and it's fascinating and it's worthy of a lot of discussion. So take your time.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about it. Can you all see my screen now?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thanks. So this is an outgrowth of a lot of work over the last year. It was led by the How Coalition, but a lot of the partners who are on this call and maybe on the Facebook Live were a part of it. We met with the Great Lakes National Program Office. We also met with some of the agencies that also pass through funding. So the Army Corps, Fish and Wildlife, NOAA, BIA, et cetera, in putting together these recommendations. What we really tried to do here, again, is our priorities were really focused on making sure that federal investments are reflecting community conservation priorities, that the agencies are held accountable, and that ultimately all communities in the region are benefiting from GLRI investments and clean water investments. And so we spent a couple months putting this together. We took Action Plan 3, and you can see here on this first area, this row or column A is the focus area, column B is the objectives, column C is the commitments, and column D are the measures of progress. And we will go through each of the focus areas. What you see in the black text is what was there in Action Plan 3. What you see in the red text are some of the recommendations that we have solicited and are putting together from our partners. I'll walk through each focus area and give sort of an overview. I'm not going to spend time going through sort of each recommendation just because I'm aware that we don't have the time to do that, but I'll try to summarize the major recommendations on each page. I also want to just sort of comment at this point, these are still in a final draft. We have not finalized these. We're hoping to have these finalized by mid-June when the public engagement sessions start, and to be sharing them with the GLAB, but also with the Great Lakes National Program Office, and also with the regional working group that administers the GLRI funds. So if we look at this first focus area, the first focus area, as many of you know, this is where 35 to 40% of GLRI funds go. This is cleaning up the most contaminated sites throughout the Great Lakes, which is known as the areas of concern, or AOCs. This is where GLRI has made significant progress, and where we also just secured an extra $1 billion in the infrastructure package to accelerate that process of cleaning up these AOCs and hopefully delisting many of them, or the majority of them. I'll say that in this focus area, the proposed changes to this focus area center on strengthening equity in achieving the cleanup of AOCs and the protection of public health from toxic pollution. You will note, people who are familiar with GLRI in the past, it has mainly only had ecological metrics, a few economic, but we're really trying to integrate some of the more cultural public health metrics in here. The changes that we suggest really accomplish this in two ways, really focusing on facilitating broader input in the public advisory councils or the citizens advisory councils based on the state that oversee the cleanup of the AOCs, and also by incorporating the use of traditional ecological knowledge. So you can, I guess everybody, I'll put that over some of the other measures of progress. The only thing I didn't mention here too is also focusing on some of the job and apprenticeship requirements. This is a lot of money that is coming to local communities, and we want to make sure that the local communities are benefiting from it in terms of job training and taxes. I will go to focus area 2, which is focused on invasive species. In this focus area, the proposed changes strengthen GLRI's prevention efforts and equity measures through the recognition and incorporation of traditional ecological knowledge and through more direct and specific language in the measures of support. So you'll see there's a little bit about lake-to-lake transfers there, but much of the recommendations are in the measures of progress. Tying it to some of the other programs that are out there and administered. And then the TEK measures, as I mentioned. Going then to focus area 3. And I'm sorry, this is a little cumbersome, but again, trying to keep this all in the same outlook as the action plan 3. Focus area 3 is nearshore health and resilience. In this focus area, we did add a few commitments and measures of progress in existing objectives. And then we also added a new objective completely. This gets a little bit more to some of the climate change goals about coastal approaches. And again, on this focus area, this area retains its emphasis on preventing and managing nutrient runoff. So we have the new objective of support innovative coastal approaches. In this area, we also wanted to emphasize and support upstream, downstream collaboratives, whether that's rural and urban, as a way to solve problems, particularly agricultural runoff on a watershed scale. And this recommendation really builds on innovative approaches to harness resources for upstream pollution prevention. Additional changes in this focus area also link flooding to polluted runoff. Flooding was not mentioned in this area, and we know that a lot of our impacted communities have really struggled with flooding throughout the region. And then also some additional changes look to harness the power of the Farm Bill, which pays farmers to take specific actions to improve soil and water quality to maximize progress. I think you can see all of this on the screen. I will then go to focus area 4, which is the focus area on habitat and species. In terms of the measures of progress, we did add some more specific measures of progress on riparian canopy, tribal acres of habitat, linear stream miles, and then again in this one we added 2 additional objectives. Support habitat restoration and protection in and around historically underserved communities, and support self-sustaining native fisheries. This focus area is intended to strengthen the biodiversity of the region by building more resilient habitat that intentionally includes tribes and parties that have historically been left out of these plans and decisions. And then it has these 2, whoops. I didn't mean to do that. I'm sorry. Hold on a second.
So as Laura's resharing, just members of the GLAB, just think about questions related to anything on the spreadsheet. I understand that the spreadsheet looks cumbersome, but imagine for Laura, she's got to actually manage the whole thing. So it's actually, I think it's very clear and very easy to read. And Laura, I assume because we've shared this with the work group, we can also share this with the full GLAB. Okay, go ahead. Back to you, Laura.
Yeah. So those are some of the main additions on focus area 4. For those of you who are familiar with the focus areas, focus area 5 historically has been a little bit of a catch-all. It is managed, it is put in adaptive management. It's been where education has been. It's been where some of the research and monitoring has been. This for us, this focus area, we feel like needs to more explicitly address climate change and equity by focusing the research, education, and science to advance specific outcomes. So in here, the first 2 don't change that much. We do have an additional commitment about integrating TEK, climate and economic justice screening tools into the GLRI adaptive management process. This is something that we've seen really quite a bit of additional tools being put out, especially by the current administration. So we specifically want to integrate those. And then we do add or suggest adding 2 new objectives. 5.3 is integrate environmental justice practice within GLRI related programs to improve the health and environment of overburdened communities. And we have some commitments there and also some measures of progress. And then 5.4, support collaboratives to expand GLRI's positive impact within historically underserved communities. And this is really trying to help build some of the capacity at the local level. And so we have associated commitments with that and measures of progress. You'll see too, one of the things that I think we recognize is quantifying some of these objective and commitments is difficult, especially when you get away from the hard sciences and more into the social sciences. And so we've tried there. I would welcome from the GLAB and also from the public, if people have alternative ways to quantify some of this or identify measures of progress. And I'll reiterate what both Scudder and Kyle said about success stories or examples of these kinds of projects where we can look at a good example and try to sort of codify or see what were some of the components of that example and what might we be able to put in as an objective, a commitment or measure of progress. We really welcome that. So I'll stop sharing at this point. Yes, Kyle and Scudder, we can share this with you all. I want to reiterate that we still are refining this. We held 5 webinars in May on each focus area. We also gave a GLRI 101 background that you can find on our website if you just want to learn more about the GLRI program. But we're still compiling some of the feedback from our members of those webinars and changing a few of these suggestions that we made. We're also continuing to meet with the agencies and our other partners. We just met earlier today with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. So we're still refining these. And so I welcome any feedback on it. And I think with that, Kyle, unless there was anything else you wanted me to touch on.
No, I really appreciate it, Laura. So anybody, GLAB members, let's hear it. Reactions, questions, thoughts. If you raise your hand, I can call on you. If you don't have your camera on, though, I don't see you. Anybody have anything they want to add or ask Laura about? Go ahead, Sylvia.
Thanks, Kyle. Laura, again, I just want to say publicly how much I really appreciate all of the work that you and Hal have put into this. It really added a tremendous amount of information up front, since you all have been following these issues pretty closely. And I think really help with the charge questions that we've got now to be able to get started, I think, sooner than later. I also appreciate how it is that you all are continuing through your organization to keep engaging other stakeholder groups. And so I think that in that spirit, one of the things that I'm hoping that we can still learn more of from the GLENPO program is where it is that we might be able to still understand what other data is available to better also build into some of the recommendations that you've already got there. I think that what the different sources of information or even collection methods would be good for us to be able to understand too, as we're also looking into how it is that the recommendations can be complemented with other information, or what it's going to look like for how anything that comes out of the recommendations that we sort of conclude will be implementable, right? So I think that we're also still striving as this work group to understand processes through GLENPO. And so there's been a lot of good things that I think have been raised in the context of even just going through the whole sets of recommendations that you all have provided so far. So I just really appreciate all of that work. Thank you.
Thanks, Sylvia. Laura, do you want to say anything?
I just wanted to say thanks, Sylvia, and also acknowledge that many of these recommendations came out of the previous GLAB report, which also was, a lot of the work of this group here.
Great. Go ahead, Larry.
Yes, again, I'd like to echo the amount of effort that went into providing and developing the document that you shared, Laura. I appreciate the fact that you took the initiative to add additional measures or whatever that those categories are, but additional rows on the table for where expansion could be added and is needed. I think those would be good recommendations to send forward. Hopefully some of those will be incorporated into the next action plan. But again, I thought the information that you provided was very, very useful for the work that we have going forward.
Thanks, Larry. That's great. Anybody else have any questions or reactions for Laura?
I do.
Go, John.
Yep. Some of the metrics are going to be challenging, I think, to specify. Make things numerical, particularly in the realm of interaction with some of the target communities and activities. Have you given thought? I'm sure you've given thought, but do you have a list of more specifics that someday you'll be able to share with us?
I would say yes and no, John. It has been a challenge, and we got a lot of feedback on that, especially I think it's, we had a long discussion on focus area 1 when we talk about EPA has quantifiable guidance for membership in PACs that reflects, things like that. And a lot of, I would say, some of our members said they want more than guidance. Guidance isn't enough. And some of our other members said, we need to allow for flexibility in here. We can't be too prescriptive because, states, a lot of this money goes down through the states. The states
Right.
provide guidance, and then they go to the specific PACs, and the PACs say, I like having some flexibility to do it this way. And so I think we are trying to sort of thread that needle in that regard of giving some direction without, hamstringing or being too directive on there. But I would say, on many of these, I think it's going to be as loose as provide guidance, and some on other ones we'll be able to say miles of this or numbers of collaboratives or things like that. So we're trying, but I don't think there's really a yes or no answer that I can give here.
Well, I think it'll be interesting that you're keeping an open mind that you may stumble across metrics that you had no anticipation of meeting, but they're valuable nonetheless. So
yeah,
interesting.
yeah. It's also brought up for us a discussion about there might be some things that don't belong in that action plan matrix and that provide more as guidance on implementation to the agency. So when you're implementing these things, here's some guidance about some of the values you might bring or the processes. They almost tend to be more process than fitting into a measure of progress.
Yeah, that's fair. Thank you.
Laura, if you collapse those into outputs and outcomes, it allows the outputs can be process oriented, the outcomes could be the actual societal benefits that we see. I don't know if that makes sense as a.
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, anybody else on the work that Laura presented? Okay. Oh, go ahead, Scudder.
Yeah, Laura, I'm curious. I'm interested in if you have any suggestions, or maybe Frank could step in terms of how can we incorporate more traditional approaches and knowledge into some of the recommendations that we're making, and how would they be represented in metrics? And I'm just curious as to how that might be done. Any thoughts?
I look to our tribal partners for most of that guidance. You know, I most recently in the last week heard a story about where there was I think it was a dam restoration project, and the scientists came in and said, we've never, you know, we don't expect to ever find these fish upstream of this dam. And some of the local tribal partners came forward and said, we have a great history and stories about finding the species of fish above this dam in this river. And it sent the scientists back to the drawing board for some more modeling. And eventually they came back and said, yes, you're right. This is a species that we might find above this dam and that we should put as a goal for this project. That's just one small example. And I don't know how to quantify it, but you know, hearing that from, I think that was from the BIA as an example of a GLRI project that, you know, incorporated some of this knowledge.
Yeah, this is Frank at Owageshik, and I appreciate all the work that you put into this. I know how much, what a monumental task this was to put all these pieces together, Laura, and appreciate that work. And at one point in your presentation there, you were talking about, you know, not being too prescriptive in the way we think about this in terms of either funding or the programs. And often what we found from our traditional point of view is that we have to be adaptive. We have to be able to think about what's happening right now. And sometimes things are changing faster than our systems, our programs, our, you know, all the other things can do. So we have to be able to adapt to things as they're occurring sometimes. And I think that that's part of our traditional ecological knowledge. It's not necessarily a list of things that we always did, or that it's not always looking backwards, but traditional ecological knowledge is also having the philosophy and the state of mind to look forward and be able to embrace what's coming, and to be open to change and open to making things happen as we find them. And so with this time of climate change coming about, there are so many things that are unusual for the way that we used to be, that we can't just look to the past. So I think that it's really important to maintain that long-term view. You know, we talk about 7 generations, for instance, within the Native community. We think of not only do we look back for what people 7 generations did and what we have now, but we're looking to the future as well. And I think that idea of the long-term consequences of what we do, but also the ability to adapt what's there. So I really picked up on that point about not being too prescriptive. So thank you.
Mhm. All right. Well, very good. Thanks, everybody. That's great feedback. Yeah, Laura, I think that's really nice. Okay, so
Yeah, very helpful. Thanks.
terrific. Okay, so Al, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kyle, and thanks, Laura. I want to know why Healing Our Waters didn't do this for climate resiliency as well. Make my life a lot easier. I really appreciate Frank being able to attend today because I know he had to squeeze this in. So thanks, Frank, for your input as always. I don't have any slides. I'm going to talk about some of our progress that we've made in our committee, including Larry, John, Scudder, and myself and Frank. And then what I want to do, there's really nice parallel construction between what's been going on in the two work groups. We also have been identifying recommendations based on the different focus areas. So I'm going to talk about some of our, our thought processes and who's responsible for those, and as appropriate, we'll turn it back to those members who have been most involved in these different areas. So based on focus area 1, which is, as Kyle said, AOCs and chemicals of concern, we want to make sure at the AOC level that we address the input of climate resiliency based on a BUI basis, a beneficial use impact basis, or impairment. So rather than looking at the AOC as a whole, some BUIs are more amenable to including climate resiliency than others. And so we would ask that in the action plan 4 that EPA and the work groups and the GLRI start thinking about climate resiliency being built in where it makes the most sense within the different BUIs. And that this resilience and adaptation should be early on in the design stages. For chemicals of concern, we want to make sure that this is dealt at ecosystem level, and not just looking at toxicity of these chemicals, but also their impacts associated with temperature change, because they're dealing with kinetics changes, as well as transportation and transit, because obviously as we get increased precipitation events, we're going to see more transportation, and these chemicals are going to be moving where they might not have moved previously. For invasives, that was led by Scudder and myself, and we identified, again, this is at the preliminary stage, as Kyle also caveated, that models dealing with where invasives may be coming from and where they, which species might be most amenable to invading our area, these models should account for changes, and particularly in extremes in temperature and dissolved oxygen. We have this tendency to focus on stationarity, and anybody dealing with climate models knows that the world is, these climates should be dealing with non-stationarity because we just don't know what's going to happen in the future. And to Frank's point, we need to be nimble. We can't think that the past is going to be prologue with respect to these models, because obviously the world is changing in ways, stochastic ways, that we have not anticipated. So we're looking for more flexibility in terms of how these models are dealing with these extremes. For not the third focus area, non-point source pollution on nearshore health, was led by Larry and John. I'm going to mention these two recommendations, and then I'm going to turn it over to them if they want to expand on what we have on paper. One is, and I've collapsed these for the sake of brevity, we need to have long-term maintenance and evaluation programs built in to assess performance, because changing weather patterns will impact the original design, because sometimes it takes years before they're implemented, and what was designed years ago may not be appropriate today. And this applies both for the nutrient loading from agricultural watersheds, as well as the untreated stormwater runoff aspects of non-point source pollution. And then also, we're looking for complementary benefits in projects. And Larry had a great example for, when we're trying to develop urban stormwater, green infrastructure to address urban stormwater, this also can be used to offset temperature impacts associated with urban heat islands. So that's just one kind of an example where we could have these kinds of win-win situations. And before I go on to the next focus area, Larry and John, do you want to weigh in at all on your recommendations? I open it up to you guys.
Larry?
Yep, thanks, Al. I'll just add a little bit. I mean, one of the things that we were looking at is what exactly is on the horizon in terms of our changing weather patterns. We're seeing very much an increase in that short duration, high intensity storm event. A lot of our design standards and practices from the ag and the urban stormwater arena really weren't designed for those type of events. So the idea is that as we start looking into the future and as we're developing new projects, how do we build that kind of resiliency into the designs? We know that a lot of our existing urban infrastructure has been in the ground for a long time. And it's not unusual to get these summer flooding events happening.
Yeah.
Or as Al mentioned, we're seeing what I call an increase in flash droughts or these high temperature events. I mean, we here in Columbus, it's been dry for 10 days and it's going to be dry for 10 more days. So we have a beginning of a drought setting in with temperatures in the 90s. These type of events are going to continue to happen. And how do we ensure that we can build into our project designs ways of addressing those issues?
I have a couple of things that I've been kind of focusing on and worrying about a little bit. Very similar because of we're getting the same amount of precipitation over a year, but how it comes, when it comes, is another matter. We have a lot of communities that have public water supplies that rely on stream flows, and EPA has recommended, and in many cases required, before communities are allowed to expand their situation, their systems, to have a minimum of 270 days of storage in an upground reservoir, to make sure that low flow conditions don't result in terrible water quality, which you get when you draw the streams down and you have a little bit of flow going over the legacy sediments, particularly in agricultural areas. You get pretty bad water quality. So all of that is designed based on historical stream flows. And if historical stream flows are no more, then you probably really don't have a 270-day situation, because you're going to get a lot of water coming down the stream fast after an intense precipitation event, and then you're going to get nothing for a long time. So I think we need to go back and look at a lot of our upground reservoirs from water supply. Similarly, wastewater treatment plants, whether they're a municipal or a manufacturing concern, anybody that's regulated under the NPDES program, if you have an individual permit, you've done some sort of a mixing model of your discharge into that receiving body of water. And I'm thinking that probably all of those are going to need to have another look and be remodeled, and there will be, requirements to make changes. They will not result in a loosening of standards. They will always result in a tightening of standards, requiring more expense and more treatment. We'll have to do it. So the repercussions are insidious, I think is the term, multi-layered, and are going to be very, very expensive to get us back to where we are, if you will.
Thanks for that rosy outlook, John.
Happy to accommodate.
I think, the bottom line here is that the baselines that we have used in the past need to now be flexible and reflect the fact that the climate is changing, and those baselines need to change as well as we see time progressing and the impacts being noticed. So that's great. Thank you both very much. The fourth focus area is habitat and species, and Scudder and myself were involved in that. We have a large number of recommendations. I'm just going to briefly mention that, and then maybe Scudder can elaborate a little bit, because most of these came from from his wisdom. From an engineering and implementation perspective, the restoration projects must be designed and constructed to address the full range of potential habitat benefits across different water level or climate regimes. And then from a socioeconomic perspective, we must temper our expectations to what the restoration project actually can achieve, and these must be explicitly identified up front. So we recognize and build in these climate changes into our original designs, initial designs. We also have to design the habitat projects to provide functional benefits across a range of these climate regimes, and then hopefully attain a broad suite of ecosystem services. So again, this notion of win-win complementary benefits that occur from these projects. So it's going to take some thought process in how to design these appropriately at the front end of these projects. We recommend incorporating landscape conservation design principles to develop these projects for species protection and habitat protection, again applied to both current and anticipated future conditions. Encourage implementation of adaptive regulatory programs. So you're going to see a lot of this language dealing with adaptation, flexibility, reflecting not just the current knowledge that Western knowledge, but also traditional and indigenous knowledge. And then finally, promote nature-based engineering practices, design approaches, basically working with nature, not against nature, to make these projects more complementary to climate resilience and climate adaptation. So with that, Scudder, anything you want to expand on there? Hopefully I captured most of your recommendations.
Yeah, I think you did. I think the landscape concept, a number of these recommendations also were incorporated in our the first cycle report on a different set of things. I think the long-term monitoring is something that we've been pushing for quite a while at the GLAB. In order to implement adaptive management, you have to monitor these systems. You have to detect change, and then allows you to manage or adjust those systems as needed to maintain a degree of functionality, or to know when to just basically walk away and say, okay, we need to do something different. I think that's important. I think the other thing is the adaptive regulatory programs. This is something that in some of the work that we're doing, the project work that we're doing, is that we're looking at adaptive, innovative designs, things that have never been done before. And the regulatory criteria are based on concepts and principles that are 30, 35, 40 years old, before climate was really recognized as, oh, gee, things are going to change. And they're based on a lot of historical data that may no longer be valid. And I think that was brought up earlier as well. And this goes to, in part, what Frank was saying, is that, hey, the past is not necessarily an indicator of the future, and that the systems in which we work, particularly the regulatory systems in which we work, we need to find ways to make them more adaptive. In other words, typically, we've had projects where we've had an innovative design, but we're told that, oh, we're not going to permit this because this doesn't meet our criteria. So we have to change the design to make it more traditional, just so it can be permitted, okay? And then 5 years from now, they say, well, you have to tell us exactly how much of this, and you're going to have. But what we have is going to be dependent on water levels. And 5 years from now, I can't tell you what Great Lakes water levels are going to be. So there needs to be a process or a different framework in which we regulate and manage these projects. I mean, we have to be protective of the environment, but we also have to be flexible. And I think this is what Al said before, that we have to be adaptive, we have to be flexible. And this is something that is not going to happen easily, because the regulatory criteria are generally in code or rule. This means we have to go back to the legislature. But I think in terms of where US EPA and GLRI looks at their investments, they need to be able to implement these projects as they are designed, these innovative projects. And right now, our regulatory programs are somewhat constraining, I think. And this is something that is of significant concern, at least to some of the work that we're doing. And I know, John is involved with some of these projects as well. So one other thing I would say is that, Laura, 3.4, engaging, including a lot of the coastal aspects into your recommendations is a very positive thing. And this ties very much into the nature-based shoreline approaches that many of the states and many of the coastal programs that are encouraging now. And I think an example, if you're talking about case studies, is in Cleveland at the Cheers Project, which Kyle is somewhat familiar with. That is a coastal resiliency project. That is not funded through GLRI. It is funded through some infrastructure funding and the National Coastal Resilience Fund. But that Cheers project is in the East Cleveland Harbor area, and it's tied to East Cleveland, which is definitely an underserved, impacted community. And the idea is to reconnect that community to the lake while we're enhancing coastal resilience. So this is an example of what Al was talking about, some of those more synergistic or integrated types of projects that address a number of these different, charge questions that the GLAB is currently working on. And I think as a template, that, and there are several other examples, such as what Larry suggested, where we need to look at broader spectrum projects, ones that are that cover a number of different elements, because I think you get more bang for the investment buck for GLRI. So
Thanks.
Thank you.
I think that's great. Let me reemphasize before we go to the last focus area that we also are looking for case studies, not just successes, but we'd like to hear about failures too, so we can learn from those. And also, while our work group has a very strong Ohio-centric composition, with the exception being me, I do hope that we can solicit examples throughout the entire Great Lakes, not just from the Lake Erie Basin. Okay. And with that soapbox walking off of, I'm going to talk about the last foundations focus area. We have a number of recommendations there, and then I'll turn it over to Frank and John, who are responsible for coming up with this. One, improved coordination. We need to have the participating agencies coordinate better and possibly assign personnel to be co-located within the GLMPO offices to help facilitate that. To get to Scudder's point and John's point, which we've heard many times and certainly worthy of reiteration, we need to streamline permitting, allow more flexible permitting to adapt to deal with this changing climate. We need to provide grant funding flexibility to support adaptive management approaches. We need an education component, and Laura starts talking about that. Better collaboration with Indigenous communities to improve our cultural understanding of climate resiliency and how to implement that. And then finally, a report card or a dashboard from GLMPO and partners that address their previous responses to GLAB recommendations to make sure that what we're working on, the time and effort we're putting in as part of GLAB members, actually has an impact. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Frank and John to expand on those. And hopefully, again, I hope I captured your main themes.
Frank, would you like to lead off? Or?
You're muted, Frank. Thank you.
John, you can go ahead.
Okay. The first one about improving the coordination among the agencies. I guess I'm in a lot of meetings with lots of agencies on at the same time, and Zoom meetings are helpful, like today. But there's just nothing like having someone across the hall that when something occurs to you, the aha moment or something, that you can go check it out. I think that's the way real efficient collaboration starts. And having an entity that is assigned from one agency to participate with GLMPO and be co-located with similar people, I think could be very, very powerful. We know that it is not uncommon for US EPA to lease an employee from the Army Corps of Engineers or the United Health Service and fill a role within another agency while being officially a member of a third agency. I see that and work with those people all the time, and they work very effectively. So I'm just thinking that the physical location there with the core team could really spark some good discussion and dialogue and some efficiencies there. The second thing that we were talking about, streamlining permitting, there's some of that done now. I mean, it's not uncommon for entities to hold joint public hearings on a permit, perhaps. But I go back to the CERCLA program, where you have, applicable and relevant regulatory programs that are met under a circular approach, but you don't have to get the separate permit. And boy, the timing and the steps necessary to go through getting multiple permits for the same project, just it takes a lot of money and a lot of time. As a consultant, I appreciate that, but on the other hand, when you're working on a project that lasts years, that from a consulting real design standpoint, there's a couple of months of activity in those 2-year period. That's not rewarding professionally, and I gladly give that up for some streamlined permitting. Plus, when we're talking about resiliency, quite frankly, some of the projects that come on the horizon or come on our screen they're urgent, they're needed, or there's nothing to talk about from a resiliency standpoint, or the cost to save something might be $100,000. A storm event or two, that could be $1 million. So, while we're studying these things, as we noted, we're letting the perfect get in the way of the good sometimes. The other one that we've talked about in some detail is funding flexibility. If you have a metric and you have a goal under an AOC or a beneficial use impairment that you're trying to correct, usually you have a handful of those, right? And they don't all come just uniquely one chemical concern or one impacted species, or it's only that you have no access to the public, to the waterfront, that sort of thing. It's a handful of things. And so we can come up with some alternative approaches for restoration initiatives that, depending upon things like water levels or stormwater intensity or water temperature, nutrient loads, invasive species, et cetera, they may not hit the mark on as designed on all of them, but actually some of them might turn out a little better than anticipated, and we should accept that and build on that. Especially from an adaptive management standpoint, you'll learn what works in a given place with Mother Nature, and you want to take advantage of that and leverage what seems to be working. We're terrible at predicting exactly how everything is going to work in a water environment in the Great Lakes. So let's be honest, but we can be effective without being perfect there. So the funding flexibility needs to be there as well, so that we can maximize lessons learned as we are implementing improvements in a sort of an iterative approach. And I will stop with that.
Thanks, John. That's great. Frank?
Yeah, I would talk about a couple points here, and one of them is that we too often we expect government to do everything for us, or we expect things that somehow we're gonna wave a magic wand and things are gonna change, and that actually, unless whatever programs we do are encouraging local involvement and public involvement, until the large swath of the public is definitely bought in and engaged with the projects, they can come and go and not have much lasting impact. It's only when we actually get that impact into, say, the next generation. So I talked about 7 generations a couple minutes ago, but we've got to whatever programs that we're going to be encouraging need to be ones that look to that idea about building that next generation. I look around all of us are relatively old on this meeting, and who's going to be here in 20 years? Who are the next ones coming up? How are those people going to be around doing these things? And where are those people in our communities? So I think about that. So much of what needs to be done needs to be done by what the man in the street, so to speak, or the person in the street, that we needs to be thinking about attitude. So that idea about education component of any of the programs I think is really a critical part. A second thing that is that too often we think about adaptation as only being some physical infrastructure. How are we going to harden or unharden a shoreline, for instance? Thinking about the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure of things, and thinking about all of this. Hopefully you can hear me. I just got a notice that my internet seems to be coming and going, but
you're good right
now. But I think that we need to think about adaptation is programs that help encourage our societal systems, our governance systems, and the governance systems, but even just neighborhood organizations and things that encourage people to accept the changes that are coming and to work with it, work with those changes. So I'm thinking about this as it's the kind of things we need are to encourage our societies to be able to deal with the changes that are coming. So for instance, encouraging programs that would work in this direction and give people the space to think about this stuff without relying on people outside of them to deal with that someone else is going to do it all for them. So anyway, that's the kind of stuff that I think is important. And I think that as we look at what would be when we're giving the answers to these charge questions, we're trying to help affect how money is going to be spent. And I think it's important us to figure out how to help guide that in ways that will have lasting multi-generational effects. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Frank. Any other comments from the GLAB as a whole on what we're dealing with climate resiliency? Sylvia.
Thanks very much, Alan. I appreciate all of what you all reported. It sounds like it's really good work so far. I wanted to ask though, I think when I'm hearing what you all are describing so far and what it is that we're working on the other work group, I see a lot of space for intersection on the questions themselves. And I'm wondering if you all have looked at the questions and what you're already describing around climate resiliency and the issues around extreme temperatures and how those also have space, I would think, in the ways that you're already doing some of your assessments of the issues. If there's space in there where you're thinking that you might also be able to comment on the issues around public engagement and how it is that we can build greater equity in how to address some of those questions and issues that you're starting to bring forward. I was wondering if you had a chance to maybe think more about that, because I'm thinking that there's definitely room for us to be more complementary across the questions, especially as we build toward the report later. Thank you.
Absolutely, Sylvia. In fact, I think one of the next sessions on the agenda is to address that explicitly. But some of the things we've been talking about really do lend themselves to that kind of overlap. One area in particular is gentrification, green gentrification. And so we've talked about that as an example, but there are a bunch of others. And we've been kind of keeping them in the parking lot to have that broader discussion with your work group as well. And I know Scudder has also been, that's been top of mind for him as well. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Scudder and we can continue on this. But thank you for kind of preloading that, Sylvia, because that's exactly where we want to go with this.
Yep. Yeah, I think that the idea of synergies and first thing I would say in terms of the agenda, we are at 3:30 Central Time at this point. And I think I will, from the messages I've got through the chat and from Frank, is that no public request for questions or comments has come in, did not come in by 3 o'clock at this point. And apparently we don't have a mechanism for some of the people to ask questions if they're not on the Zoom info, unless they send in the email request. So at this point, I don't believe that there are going to be any public comments. And I think just to follow up, the concept of synergies, I think, is really important. And I tried to highlight this a bit earlier. And I think part of it is in the how recommendations as well. But I really do think that is in terms of some of the recommendations that we have, is that we do need to indicate in those recommendations how broad spectrum that particular recommendation could be to US EPA in terms of how can you make an investment with GLRI funds or develop an initiative that covers a broad range of issues that GLRI is attempting to address based on, in part, these charge questions. I think that's critically important. And I would encourage us, as we move a little bit further down the road, particularly in terms of the implementation strategies, because I think this is where the implementation strategies are critical. And it ties back to some of the metrics discussion we had earlier as well, because I know in the past that in terms of how some of the projects are selected is a function of how US EPA actually measures success with the types of metrics they have. I know in the habitat world where I work, there for wetlands, you have water quality benefits and you have habitat benefits. And yet the metrics for both of those focus areas are different. And there was a period of time, even though that's now changing, where you would apply, you'd say, well, we're going to be constructing a wetlands project that has these benefits, but you had to choose which metrics and which focus area you would apply for funding for. And yet the other benefits would not be counted because, oh, this is a habitat restoration project. It is not a water quality improvement project, but wetlands do both. And so I think this is the type of thing that we need to think about it. And when we develop our recommendations and prioritize those recommendations in terms of, can we find projects? Can GLRI find projects and their federal partners find projects that cover this broad base where we deal with climate related issues, but we can do it in targeted communities and underserved communities and help build capacity in those communities. So. And I'm looking for any advice or guidance, and perhaps case studies would be most helpful, as we mentioned before as well. Yes, Sylvia, please.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much, what you offered there, Scudder, and look forward to us doing more of that kind of integration in the project here. One other thing maybe that I want to just, not so much offer, but maybe just keep us very conscious of, and this is something that we did have an opportunity to discuss when we had our in-person work group meetings, is really about how it is we're also in the context of trying to help improve public engagement throughout the Great Lakes and clearly through the GLRI, how it is that we're also working to make language accessible so that people can find how this connects with their life or the issues that they're most concerned about, and not getting lost in sort of the way that things tend to be framed, either from a scientific, perspective, or in ways that they don't seem connected to the local experiences that they have. So just again, as we're thinking about both how it is that we're framing our recommendations and even what the report will look like, that we're hopefully constantly moving toward that kind of better improvement of how it is these issues are discussed so that they're accessible to more people. So just wanted, I know that that's something that several of us have raised already, but just wanted to, hopefully we have consensus on that across the GLAB. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Any other comments or questions at this point? Okay, John, if you could bring up the presentation, there's one last slide I need to show. We can wrap up the meeting, and then I believe Todd can adjourn the meeting. So,
and Scudder, if I can just share, excuse me, 2 points before you move on to the next thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks to Sylvia for prompting these. So first, I'm going to start with a shameless plug, and that is, just sort of the board is aware of this, but for those listening in on the live stream, just want to make sure that people are aware that $30 million of GLRI funds was just made available in a request for applications with the primary goal of implementing projects that will benefit underserved communities. It's a very different model than what we've done in the past, where we're not directly going to be funding the, either underserved communities themselves or different organizations that will be working hand in hand with underserved communities, but we'll be looking to fund what we are calling principal recipients. And I really think that this is going to allow for better communication, better integration, allowing access to federal funding to entities that would not normally have that access to federal funding. So that's my shameless plug. There will be a webinar in about 2 weeks. If people missed the first webinar about 2 weeks ago, that I would encourage everyone to participate in. And second, I noted that when Laura gave her presentation on the objectives, commitments, and measures that the How Healing Our Waters Coalition has developed, there was some discussion about sources of data. I think John and Sylvia both sort of indicated, there could be challenges there. So what I'll offer up the work groups of the advisory board is, if there's an interest, we can convene some Glenpoe experts with each work group to talk about what data is readily available that we collect, where there may be some opportunities, and where there's probably going to need to be a lot more discussion. Again, that shouldn't necessarily change your recommendations, but if that would be helpful for the board to understand that, I will extend that offer.
Yep. Thank you, Todd. If there's anyone on the board who wants to follow up, just contact me. I'll talk with Todd, and we'll see if we can set up a meeting or a discussion about those data sources if there's an interest in pursuing that. So more than happy. Okay. If we bring up the slide, I just need to go to the last slide. It's just a timeline for the GLAB, just to say, hey, this is what's coming next. And I promise this is like a wrap-up slide. This is the draft timeline. It's been slightly modified recently, but we're currently in May, at the very end of May, but we made it by May with the public GLAD meeting, which we are just about to complete. We are looking toward the end of June. Hopefully in July, we will continue deliberation, but hopefully in July, we will have a set of draft recommendations together. We may again have another GLAB public meeting, hopefully sometime in mid-late July, to share those draft recommendations with the public and receive public comment. We would certainly encourage the public who are still on to provide comments to us when they can. At this point, the formal public comment session is not going to happen because we have no one who wanted to ask questions, or we will receive written comments separately. And hopefully by sometime in October, we may have a set of final recommendations. Certainly, we want to receive input from the public and perhaps from US EPA and the other federal agencies that are involved with the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And hopefully our recommendations will then be able to be incorporated and considered during the final development of Action Plan 4. And based on this timeline, it would appear as though Action Plan 4 would be issued in final form in September 2024. So I think we could get this done fairly expeditiously with respect to the work groups. I think we have made considerable progress. You can just cut the slide now, John. And finally, I would just like to thank all of the GLAB members and the EPA staff and all the folks that have attended, both public and from other agencies. for listening to us deliberate on these charge questions. I appreciate the insight and the hard work that all of us have put in up to this point, and we're going to have to continue this level of effort in order to make the deadlines, which I think are somewhat ambitious but certainly doable. And I'm going to turn it over to Todd now to finally adjourn the meeting. And have a great day.
Great. Thanks, Scudder. I'll be very, very brief and just say thank you all. What I heard today was fantastic. I can tell there's been a lot of time and effort and thinking put into it. So I'm really looking forward to the ongoing work of the board. And with that, I will adjourn the meeting.
Yep.
Bye, everybody.
Nice job, Scudder.
Yep.